Good morning, everyone. We are gathered here today for the Path Ahead webinar series, and our episode today is extraordinarily interesting and extraordinarily our most popular episode so far. We'll be taking a look at the ticketed entry system and the ripple effect of that system on surrounding lands. We'll hear from land managers, and we will hear about the community impacts as well. Our guests today are, we have Mary Riddle from Glacier National Park, Chris Prue from the Forest Service, Flathead National Forest. We've got Jim Williams from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. We have invited Dave Landstrom, but we hear through the grapevine that he might be stuck in a blizzard antelope hunting. So we'll see. In which case Jim will cover for him. And then we have Diane Medler from Discover Kalispell. Next slide. So this episode is a little bit different than ones that we've done in the past. First of all, we are going to co-host with the National Parks Conservation Association and Sarah Lundstrom. So Montana Access Project and NPCA work together both to develop the content and run the webinar to tell the story of the Glacier National Park, both inside the park and outside the park. And I'll have Sarah introduce herself in a minute. Next slide. The key takeaways today are that we're going to hear are, we're going to learn from this first season of the ticketing system in Glacier. As folks who live here, which I do, it was sort of unexpected. And the latest on what the ramifications of that were and what the insights were from the park. And then hear about the impacts on the surrounding lands. We'll share ideas about what we're looking at impacts on surrounding lands, what we're looking at for the future of that ticketing system in Glacier and maybe elsewhere, and just have a discussion about what does sustainable recreation, sustainable tourism look like at a very high level. I mean, I don't know that any of us have the answers, but it will be interesting to see what's the latest on this ticketed entry system. Next slide. So first, we're going to do a poll, and that will be in Zoom. So go ahead, and I'm going to turn it over to the team to launch that poll. Is it happening? Okay, maybe we'll skip that poll. So the reason that we're here today is that we know that outdoor recreation is the hub of quality of life, health and wellness, and economic impact in many of our communities. Next slide. Next. In putting these episodes together, we have identified the keys to success for successful outdoor recreation. And we this time we have, if you can click three clicks, our focus for these episodes are engagement, how we engage the community, planning, and operations and maintenance for successful outdoor recreation experiences. Next slide.
All right. As Diane mentioned, I'm Sarah Lundstrom. I work for the National Parks Conservation Association. I'm the Glacier program manager, so I'm based in Whitefish, Montana. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about NPCA in a bit, but I wanted to get you guys all sort of situated and on the same landscape. And it sounds like we have quite a few folks that maybe aren't from here and don't quite know the area we're talking about. So here's what we're looking at. On this map, Glacier National Park is in purple. The green to the west and south is the Flathead National Forest. The yellow is the Blackfeet Indian Reservation on the east. And then there are state parks and state lands sprinkled across the whole landscape. And then Kalispell finally is just to the north of Flathead Lake. Next slide. And like layers of an onion, or ogres, depending on who you are, there are rings of impact that we're going to explore today and do so in order. So the first is internal park impacts, both on the Going to the Sun Road, which had the reservation system, but also other areas where people went when they didn't have a ticket to get in. The North Fork and Two Medicine saw huge increases in visitor numbers this year. A lot of what we're hearing is people would drive to Two Medicine when they got to West Glacier without a ticket, and then go to St. Mary's after the 5 p.m. ticket requirement was over, therefore being able to drive to Sun Road and go somewhere else in the park. There's also impacts to neighboring public lands. A lot of people who came without a ticket expanded onto surrounding public lands and the national forest, though we do know that a lot of people who come to visit Glacier also recreate on national forests and state lands anyways. 2020 saw RVs and tents in pretty much every single pull-off along Forest Service roads. And I think most of us here saw the pictures of things like dispersed camping at Blankenship on the Flathead River. And then finally, there's impacts to communities. Gateway communities like Kalispell, Whitefish, and Columbia Falls are seeing increasing number of people every year. Some of that's welcome, but there is a tipping point that gets reached sometimes where more is not always better. And the increase of people moving into communities changes the nature of those, the ability for locals to live there and to live where they work, and even the ability for some folks to find employees. Next slide, please. So a little bit about NPCA. We were formed in 1919 by the first director of the Park Service to be an independent voice for national parks, to protect them from threats both internal and external, and to build support for new parks. So for the last 100 years, NPCA has been advocating on behalf of parks across the country. Our first century was about protecting parks. But through all the work that we've done, we've realized that parks don't do well as islands. So this second century is a lot about connecting them to the surrounding landscapes through corridors and other protected spaces, and to communities through education, and making sure that parks represent the full breadth of American life. Next slide. And I would like to start talking about the Organic Act of 1916. This tells what the Park Service, National Park Service, was tasked with, and therefore what national parks are designed to do. And that's to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such a manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And I would say at this point, there's an increasing tension between protecting park resources and visitor experience and the number of people coming to visit national parks. The question has become, how do we protect park resources and a variety of experiences, including quiet backcountry solitude, in the face of ever-growing visitation, while also increasing access to underrepresented communities? Next slide. So nationwide park visitation has been trending upwards for decades. I suspect that's not a surprise for anybody. But for instance, just between 2006 and 2016, parks saw a 21% increase in visitation. Post-Park Service Centennial visitation has stayed high. So the Park Service Centennial happened in 2016. In 2017, Glacier saw its record year with 3.3 million visitors. And 2019 brought 330 million visitors to the park system system-wide. But all those people are not spread equally. In 2020, half of the 240 million recreation visits occurred in the top 23 most visited parks, which means just 6% of parks in the national park system hosted 120 million visitors. This multi-year increase in visitation at some parks and destinations and concurrent impacts to resources in the visitor experience is certainly one of the biggest challenges facing the National Park Service in its second century. Next slide. So COVID 2021 both exacerbated the problem in some places and was also an anomaly in terms of visitation levels. Glacier, to use an example, this is blue is 2019, which was a typical year of visitation, with the peak being in July and August. Orange represents 2020, which when Glacier was closed from late March till early June and opened with limited access as all of the east side entrances remained closed. But visitation rebounded by fall above 2019 levels, and the park actually set several monthly records between October of 2020 and March of 2021. And then that gray bar you see is what has occurred so far, well, at least through when I pulled these slides, which is most typically a normal visitation year. Those spring levels particularly were higher than 2019. This is another example. Yellowstone had a record fall of 2020 and spring of 2021 in terms of visitation. And this summer had its first month where more than 1 million visitors visited in 1 month. Many other parks set visitation records later into the fall months, all during a time, remember, when international travel was almost non-existent. So this isn't just a problem unique to Glacier. It's a story that can be told about just about any large landscape park in the West. Next slide. And it's not just the changing nature of visits to parks due to the COVID pandemic. Climate change, extended shoulder seasons, shrinking off seasons, and growing remote work opportunities means many parks are likely to continue to see increasing visitation in the coming years. There's also an increase in visits because of social media influencers, the so-called selfie generation, and new forms of recreation like pack rafts and e-bikes. Visitor expectations are also changing when it comes to things like internet access and cell phone service. And all of these changes impact how, when, and why people come to parks. Next slide. And so we're seeing impacts in parks. In diminished visitor experience because of traffic congestion, lack of interaction with rangers, long lines for basic services, and loss of quiet and solitude. There's life safety concerns around human waste and incident response time. And we've heard rumors of road and actually parking lot rage. There's also damage to cultural and natural resources. 2020 particularly saw an increase in graffiti, dogs in parks, litter, social trailing, wildlife displacement, soil erosion and plant loss, and camping in closed locations. And finally, there's impacts to park staff and infrastructure. Staff retention is harder. It's difficult because people are taking on more jobs. There's increasing stresses on staff. There's increasing search and rescue. There's damages to park infrastructure, and then the wear and tear that we see on trails, roads, bridges, historical structures, things like that. Next slide. There's also impacts to neighboring public lands. With overflow visitation, like Forest Service and BLM lands and smaller National Park Service sites that aren't prepared for the number of visitors that they're getting. There's dispersed camping and the accompanying problems that go with it, like human waste, social trails, food and garbage storage. And then these landscapes tend to suffer from a lack of resources. They don't have as much money as the Park Service does. And so they're understaffed and they don't have the infrastructure to deal with increasing visitation, nor can law enforcement or rangers keep up with outreach and enforcement. And finally, again, just like in parks, there's safety issues, like food storage in bear country, or people camping right next to busy roads. Next slide. And finally, there's impacts to the community. Visitor experience for people coming here with a lot of traffic and congestion and long lines for services. And there's quality of life impacts for residents with increasingly crowded parks, trails, and restaurants. There's affordable housing concerns, which leads to an inability for businesses to recruit staff. And there's changes in community character with potentially empty second homes and the increasing cost of living forcing locals out. Next slide. So one of the ways to deal with that is through what we call visitor use management. And those tools fall into a number of buckets, like what you see here: messaging and communications, infrastructure and facilities, transportation, permits and reservations. Those are internal. There's also external things like dispersal to other areas. No one action is going to be the silver bullet, and it's going to take experimentation to find the right combination of tools. And that combination of tools is not going to be one size fits all. Each park and community needs to find the right ones for them. In the meantime, parks across the country are already trying some of these ideas out. Rocky Mountain and Yosemite National Parks implemented reservation systems in 2020. We've all seen pictures of cars lined up outside of arches when they closed the entrance gates. Zion's shuttle system changed how people access that park, but hasn't quite solved the visitation problem yet. And these are just a few examples. Glaciers use some of these tools too, like the recreation access display to give live updates on the status of campgrounds and parking lots, or the one-in, one-out access we've all heard about at Polebridge and Many Glacier. The pilot of a reservation system on McLennan Road is just another tool in the toolbox. That said, another piece of the puzzle is studying the impacts of those actions taken, like the reservation system, on both visitor experience and resource protection. And from preliminary results of a study that was done this summer by Utah State University researchers, 70% of people favored some form of reservation system for the going to the Sun Road in the future, which means maybe it's working. Next slide.
All right, we'll try this poll again. And if you have questions for Sarah, Sarah said she was going to talk fast, and by golly, she did. There was a lot of information there. And if you do have questions about the research that NPCA is doing on the visitor experience, that's great. Okay, so we're having trouble with the poll. So next slide. All right,
Next
Sarah,
slide.
would you? Yes, Sarah, take it away.
Absolutely. So as Diane mentioned before, Mary Riddle is the Chief of Planning at Glacier National Park. She's also working on Glacier's visitor use program. She's been with the National Park Service for 38 years, but rumor has it won't hit 40 since she's retiring at the end of this year. And she's going to talk to us about Glacier's ticketed entry system on the Sun Road and some of the changing visitation trends the park saw because of the ticketed entry system. So take it away, Mary.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so next slide. And then Rachel, go ahead and go to the next slide. So Sarah just kind of, I think, really covered all the reasons of all the things that were happening that triggered us to pilot a temporary ticketed entry for Glacier this summer. For us, we had started looking at this in 2020, and due to the late, how long it took us to get ready to implement it, we decided not to. We started a little bit earlier in 2021. We were still seeing this unprecedented visitation coming, but the real tipping point for us was the road construction that the Montana Department of Transportation had informed us in January that they were going to start doing on Highway 2. And the West Glacier entrance was right in the middle of that. So next slide. The Glacier International Airport added 70,000 seats to coming into the area, in addition to the fact that there was a rental car shortage throughout the country. And so all of these things were making us feeling like this was the summer to try this pilot program and see how it went. So next slide. We started working on goals for 2021, and certainly visitor congestion was one of our big ones, and setting visitor expectations for congestion and those construction delays. We did not learn until March 10th that that the east side of the park was going to reopen. So we were having to be still working with lots of uncertainty and having to pivot. We as you all are well aware, that we never opened the border between Canada and the US, but that was another big unknown for us as to whether that was going to be reopened, and then therefore another source of visitation coming down from the north. But we moved forward knowing that we had to be quick on our feet with lots of things happening. Next slide. So one of the pieces of information that we spent quite a lot of time looking at was these two graphs showing the 2019 visitation through the west entrance and then the 2020. And what was very compelling for us was that there was not a whole lot of difference in the numbers coming in. And in 2020, we had to close the west entrance due to gridlock. and congestion a number, I believe it was 28 times throughout the summer. So it was it was again another reason why we had to look at a different way to manage visitor access. Next slide. So we started the pilot. I have to say we did not do this in a vacuum. As Sarah mentioned, other parks had tried to do it, had been doing it in 2020, and were continuing to do it in 2021. So we had a lot of parks to talk to: Yosemite, Rocky Mountain, Acadia, Muir Woods, Zion, to learn from their what they learned during that first year and changes they were making into their second year. So that was, we went into this with a lot of help. Next slide. And it was really became an all hands on deck. We could not have done this without the Glacier National Park Conservancy and the extra funding that they were able to provide for us to buy a lot of equipment and things that we needed to make the ticketed entry system work. MDOT was instrumental in giving us the ability, helping us open another contact station outside the park in Hungry Horse. That was key to contacting people before they got into the various construction zones on the highway. And then of course, all the businesses, our neighbors, all the communities around Glacier were so important to this being a success. So, so we kind of went into this with needing lots of help, and I will say going forward, this is still a big community effort, as Sarah talked about. This is not Glacier's problem only. So next slide. So there's been a lot of questions about how we calculated the numbers, and just to be quick, it was the ticket amounts actually, the number of tickets each day varied by month because of the different kinds of activities that took place during each month. In terms of the concessioners had different levels from past years. So we use that to help inform us as to the number of tickets that we could make available. So that was one factor that went into it. All the people who already had, all visitors who had reservations, whether it was a hotel room, a campground, a horseback ride, a guided hike, those were counted as visitors coming in, and those were their tickets. We had to add numbers for tribal members, for landowners, for employees, for others that could get, for businesses that could gain access to the park that didn't need a ticket. We had to think about and look at past surveys to determine the length of stay that people stayed in the park, and that helped us again calculate. So whether it was, we had learned that in a previous survey that on average people stayed 4 days in the park. So that was a data point for us. And then we looked at past data on gate closures. And so those numbers were all calculated, like I said, by month. But because of information that we received from staff and others during the each day during the summer, we were also able to vary these amounts. So it was, we tried to be very reactive to what was actually happening out in the park as well. Next slide. The results, I think those of you who are here actually saw, we didn't have any closures of the entrance stations. We had minimal congestion in the park and in the communities of West Glacier. We didn't have any substantial gridlock that occurred, and the filtering system that we set up worked very well. We were really happy with that. By the end of the season, we had a 15% diversion rate. So that was people that did not get access because they didn't have a ticket or another way to get into the park, into the going to the Sun Road corridor during the hours between 6 and 5. But this did not mean that they didn't get access either before 6 or after 5 at some point during their visit. We also talked with every visitor that came to the St. Mary and West Glacier entrance, and we still remain very busy, and our popular locations still filled. That did not change. Next slide. We did a lot of monitoring during this last summer. We had real-time counters counting vehicles at the 3 entrances to the going to the Sun Road corridor, both at Camas, St. Mary, and going to the Sun Road. We knew how many vehicles were being turned around during ticketed entry. We had staff out on the road giving us information in real time about what kinds of conditions that they were seeing. And we had cameras on key parking lots to monitor fill times. We are also, as you all are well aware, the other park entrances, the valleys, were receiving a lot of visitation because they were not tickets were not required for those, although because of that visitation, they were having to close frequently, and we were gathering all of that information as well. So lots of numbers were being collected throughout the summer. Next slide. And with that data, we were we were fortunate to have a transportation fellow with us this last summer who was able to do a lot of data crunching with those numbers about vehicles at one time and average numbers of vehicles, what our diversion rates look like, all the contributions that were going on by the staff, et cetera. So, and the effects on the park operations. Next slide. So in general, just for the full season, and this slide is a little mislabeled, the orange line is 2019 and the blue line is 2021. You can see in 2019 that we would have this peak about 10 o'clock in the morning. In the result of ticketed entry was it lowered that peak. But we did have these peaks before 6 and after 5 o'clock because of ticketed entry, but because they weren't all occurring at the same time, we were able to handle the numbers of visitors coming in. Next slide. And then the average number of vehicles right on the Sun Road, you can see the darker line is 2021. We were able to lower that from 2019, which is the lighter line as well. So in the end, we felt that it was quite a success, although not perfect. So next slide. And then finally, these are our daily vehicle entrances starting from the end of June when the road just before or right around the road opened to mid or first week in August. The blue line is 2019, the green line is 2021, and the dots on the green line indicate days that we would have had to have had gate closures at the entrances based on the number of vehicles that were coming even into the corral. So again, we felt that in terms of managing the numbers of visitors, this was very successful. Next slide. We did have some unintended consequences with that were not bad consequences. The MDOT, Montana Department of Transportation, was able to install a temporary traffic light, which did, which helped a great deal in kind of pulsing traffic through West Glacier. And then they were able to extend the turn lane on Highway 2, which gave visitors a queuing line because of that traffic light, and thus traffic was not backed up on the highway. And our concessionaires in June saw a 50% increase in activity. Next slide. Notes from the field. Basically, Logan Pass filled quite a bit earlier, although that has been happening for well over 20 years. Every year the pass fills, that parking lot fills earlier and earlier. But compared with 2019, when it would fill about 8:30 to 9:15, it was filling at 6:30 to 6:45. The big thing to note here is that normally we have multiple closures in 2019 where and even in past years where we had to close Logan Pass 6 or more times during each day because of filling. And in 2021, there were no days with that many closures happening. So next slide. And you can just hit it. So the valleys, as I said, and received quite a lot of visitation. Both Polebridge and Mini Glacier had been seeing more and more visitation through the years, and having to close gates often during each day. But in 2021, this last year, Two Medicine joined that situation with having to close quite a bit, 29 days out of the 72 days this last summer. Next slide. So we learned a lot from this season, and I think we all did here. Of our tickets sold out very quickly. We had thought that we would have tickets available throughout the day. That was not the case. They sold out within the first 10 to 15 minutes of being online, and some days even faster than that. The recreation.gov site was overloaded. And Glaciers was the most visited site on the of all the agencies, all the sites that are on rec.gov. So it crashed a lot. Accessibility was a concern of ours. People that could not use the site and had to call in would get into a queue. Were not able to get tickets usually by the time their calls were answered. It obviously didn't work for everyone. Some of the elderly that were not as tech savvy, people who did not have fast internet connections, those all caused great difficulty in getting tickets. This was a huge demand for us on our staff. We were not able to hire all the employees that we needed to operate this ticketed entry. And so we ended up needing staff all summer to support the effort, and ended up spending over 10,000 hours in staff time to work it. The valleys became overloaded, and there were a number of other things with access to places like Apgar and the North Fork via Camas Road that were all things that we need to be looking at in the future. Next slide. So we had a lot of, we asked for stakeholder input in September. And we also asked, we very much want to hear from the community surrounding us about, how ticketed entry affected you all, and in general, what are the outcomes from it what were the positive things and what were the things that were not so positive, to help us improve visitor access management in the future. And then we also asked our staff for that similar kind of input going forward. So we're still sorting through all of that information coming in. Next slide. In looking at 2022, it's pretty clear that we are going to continue, you know, our visitation is not doing anything but going up. And so we're looking at how to manage access for next year. I think the important thing here, one of the things was that we were not able to really do a lot of research on impacts from this managed access system on our resources. And so that is one thing that we would focus on for next year. Another is to really align our shuttle strategy with congestion management actions. And then to also use the Going to the Sun Road Corridor Management Plan that was just completed and look at actions there that we can also use. Next slide. So going into 2022, there's that we have a number of options that we're looking at, but I think realization that there is still a great uncertainty with the pandemic and what we're going to be able to, what services we're going to be able to offer as for all of us. So that's something that is first and foremost in our minds. We know that this came at a cost to everybody, and certainly a cost to our visitors. And so we're trying to look at how to mitigate those costs as much as possible. Any long-term solution that we land on for the years going forward, well, we're going to hopefully use this period to try some more pilots and do some more experimenting with different ways to do this. We know that any long-term solution will need to go through some kind of public, more public involvement in analysis. And finally, that this began with Glacier being the issue. I think with Jim being here and the Forest Service, this is really an issue that we all face. We've become a very, very popular place, and we've been found. So now we're trying to figure out, put the puzzle together. So thanks.
Thank you, Mary. We have several questions, which we'll take at the end. We're going to have to make up a little bit of time here, but if you would, when you put your questions in the chat, if you would put them attention Mary or attention Jim, that would be great, and we'll try to make up some time and catch those at the end. Sarah?
Rachel, you want to go, or Andy, you want to go next slide, please? Maybe the next one. There we go. So next up is Chris Prue. He works for the Flathead National Forest. He is the Recreation, Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers and Trails Program Manager, which in my mind is pretty much all of the cool stuff. Though I suspect, as with most of our jobs, it's more paperwork and less playing than it sounds like it should be. And he's going to talk about sort of what happened on the Flathead National Forest, especially around the implementation of the ticketed entry system and just the challenges of dealing with more people in more places doing more things. Chris, go.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that. All right, next slide. So I'm going to lead into the 2021 season, kind of where Mary had left off, talking about the problem that we are all facing with increased use and just our area here in Northwest Montana being found, and kind of what we were seeing up until 2021. the Forest Service does its national visitor use monitoring to get an idea of the amount of use on each forest. It's on 5-year cycles. So 2015 is our last full cycle where we have data. And in 15, we were seeing 1.1 million visitors to the Flathead, which was an increase 90% from 2010. And as we went from 15 into 20, we were sort of tracking on that trajectory, similar to what we saw from 10 to 15. And then 2020 happened, right? Pandemic visitation. We did do NVIM surveys and counts in 2020, but we don't have numbers from that. Our surveys were significantly impacted by the pandemic on our staffing. But nationally, the Forest Service as a whole saw 168 million visitors to the Forest Service. That is essentially, or to Forest Service lands nationally. So that was essentially 17 million more visits in 1 year than what they would had expected from our normal trends. And those of us who live around the Flathead, live up in this area, we obviously saw that record use on the forest. People camping in places that we didn't know could be used for camping per se, in pullouts and unsafe spots. High use around Hungry Horse Reservoir, high use, up in the North Fork, around the park. In Swan Valley, our campground concessionaire saw record numbers in 2020. So we knew that was something that was new to us and something that we had to adapt to. As we were planning for 2021, we had the similar all hands on deck approach with the Forest Service, as Mary talked about, internally in the northern region, which is Montana and northern Idaho. We had been visiting leading up to 2021, figuring out how to set ourselves up to get ready for what we anticipated was a similar high use year in 2021. That included us, working with the partners, working with the park, working with the Chamber of Commerce's on how we can share information, just get info out to the public and prepare. Next slide. So 2021 comes at us. In addition to reeling from 2020 and planning for that, we're working with the Park Service and hearing about the ticketed entry system. Also, construction along Highway 2 from Hungry Horse through the Middle Fork corridor was something we were planning for. So figured out how we were going to work and adapt to that. In addition, the Forest Service went through similar challenges in hiring our seasonal workforce at the levels that we wanted because of all of the things that we're dealing with around the pandemic, increases in housing prices, shortage of rentals for employees. So we were kind of running into the season with that at hand. And so what did we see? When you look at the immediate reaction or the immediate change in uses around the park with ticketed entry, really had to do with just seeing some increase in use of trails and trailheads around the park, around Highway 2, popular access sites and boat ramps along the river. And in talking with the districts about this conversation, especially Hungry Horse Glacier View, they were seeing a lot more of this day use type of staging for folks. Blankenship Bridge was a spot where they were seeing folks either show up the night before and leave early to try to hit that morning entrance in the park before the ticketed entry came into play, or hanging out there during the day and heading into the park in the evenings. Those were the kind of things we saw. We saw all that use happening, as you lead up to West Glacier, sites like Half Moon Lake, which are kind of small, out of the way, day use sites where we don't see a lot of use. We were seeing that. People hiking and going to Stanton Lake, for the day and then trying to get into the park at night. Pole Bridge, we had already seen that in years prior with folks staging, in the river access site parking, waiting, if the gate was closed with the one in, one out. But just more of that was really what folks were reporting. Dispersed camping trends that we saw in 2020, we didn't see the same I guess the same level of high use, but some of those trends changed. Folks continue to camp at sites that we had never really expected to see the type of use we had. Blankenship use was still high, not as high as 2020. In some locations like gravel pits along Glacier Rim, we were seeing more camping and more long-term camping, and some of that was access. We were considering that potentially access to the park. It was close for folks to run up the road, up the North Fork and get in Camas. I know the county, Flathead County, was saying their numbers show about 1,000 vehicles a day accessing the unimproved section of the North Fork Road, and that was probably people running into the park, and it was probably also the use up in the North Fork. We were seeing more and more use at sites along the river as we did in 2020. Our campground reservations, our fee sites where you have rec.gov reservations, campgrounds, cabins, those have always been popular. They have been for 5 or 10 years. You have to get on 6 months in advance to get sites, so it's hard to show the impacts to that. When a site is full and booked, it's full and booked. But the places we were seeing it harder to find sites was our first come, first serve, or our walk-in sites at our campgrounds. It really changed folks' availability to make last-minute plans and go camping, as some of us, including myself, were impacted by that. If you're bad planners hoping to get a site for the weekend, it was a lot harder to do. Our outfitter and guides, especially those that are around West Glacier on the river, had a really busy season. We were seeing a lot more of requests for short-term, like rec event permits and temporary outfitter and guide permits. So is that attributed to the ticketed entry, or is it attributed to the use coming here? I think it's all related, as Mary had said. And then our winter use, the ski areas had a pretty good season in 2020, 2021. And we saw with Flathead Avalanche Center increased use at our backcountry winter trailheads. So you have these use trends that continue to be coming at us, and we really need to be thinking ahead and working together on how we move forward. Next slide. So going forward, I mean, when you look at increasing use, doesn't always mean we have a problem. We can look at that as creating advocates for public lands and more supporters and shared stewardship in what we do. Some of the positive aspects of 2020 and 2021 have to be our work with our partners. Flathead River Alliance stood up and really took off this year, and the foresters and the park worked with them to do some education at access sites to help users understand rules and regulations, ethics, all good things. The Flathead Avalanche Center and Friends of the Flathead Avalanche Center are working with the public on education on how to safely maneuver the backcountry as we see more people coming here. The partner list goes on and on. I think that's something we need to keep doing, and impressed with how well it's going. The focus on education and coordination and information sharing is wildly important. I know the Hungry Horse District, with their location in Hungry Horse, they work with the park really well for planning. But this year they had some weekly and bi-weekly meetings just talking about information to share with the public and how to work with the visitors and what we can suggest as we see the trends increase, and that was wildly successful. So I'm hoping we continue that moving forward, and then just continuing to work with the public on our resource protection use as we engage the community. We're in whether it be planning efforts, we're using our forest plan from 2018 as the basis going forward. We're continuing to work on our Flathead Wild and Scenic River comprehensive management plan, and just engaging the public and helping to work together on what we think are the best things we can do to preserve the resource, but also provide for the use on the forest. It's important that we're looking forward at the next generation of stewards and figuring out how, as Mary had ended her presentation, how we can work together as this trend continues. I don't think we're going to see an end to it yet. So I will stop there.
Are we going to try that poll again, or are we just going to move past it? I think move past it. Our next speaker is Jim Williams, and I believe Jim is also going to be covering for Dave Landstrom. Jim's the Region 1 Director for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. He's a mountain lion guy, and in fact has written a really fantastic book about them called Path of the Puma. He's going to give us big picture around outdoor recreation development and how it impacts wildlife. He's also going to give us some of Dave's stuff around increasing visitation in state parks. And he's had a lot of coffee this morning, so be prepared for a bit of a wild ride.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm going to make up some time here. So my name's Jim Williams. I'm out of the Kalispell office. For those of you that do not know me, we have a pretty large team here in Northwest Montana at FWP with fisheries and game wardens. You may have met them, wildlife biologists, and parks. And our parks division has been recently reorganized into a new parks and outdoor recreation division, in part because of these demands and pressures that we're all talking about with outdoor rec here in the Flathead Valley and elsewhere. So in terms of wildlife response, I think we have the next slide. So there's impacts to wildlife, increased pressure and trends. I guess I'm going to go through just a few issues that are on our minds here. And first off, it's difficult to tease out the variable that has the impact on fish or wildlife species or populations or habitats from just the displacement of ticketed entry visitors from Glacier National Park this past summer. Because if you think about this crush of humanity that has showed up in the Flathead and elsewhere in the West, there's been a migration of humans from both coasts and Texas to these mountain towns, and we're one of them on the top of the list. COVID refugees, migrants, climate migrants. When California, Oregon, and Washington caught on fire, we've all heard the stories of folks that landed here and bought property. And then social unrest on both coasts, whether it be riots or homeless encampments, regardless, we hear the stories where folks have bought land here and property here. So it's hard to just tease out displacement of visitors from Glacier, especially when the timing was such that it happened in the same period as all these other migrations landed here. So it'd be great to have a social scientist, a professional from one of the universities, look at why people moved here and how. So displacement is just one of many factors that landed on top of our fish and wildlife resources that we have managed and dealt with the last 2 years. So first off, right off the no-brainer, everyone sees them in the news, it's bears. And so how do displaced visitors in Glacier impact bears in a negative way? Well, I'm going to go to the VRBOs in Columbia Falls and Big Fork and Whitefish in particular. There's no sanitation requirements. A lot of these visitors, when they can't get to Glacier, they want to go to Big Fork or Whitefish, some of these high marketed towns, and they don't know how to care for garbage, and there's no requirements. And we have been crazy busy in most of these resort towns with conflict bears at VRBOs and even long-term residents both. So that's an obvious one. Also recreation around bears. The incidence of a conflict from a mountain biker, a runner, a hiker, you name it, outside front country recreation. All these visitors that didn't get into the park landed in and around the park, and they're out having a great time. So the conflict potential can go up. However, I will say we have not seen any significant injuries or wildlife bear human conflict events off the top of my head right now. So so far, knock on wood, it's been pretty good. We're not out of the woods yet, but that's always a concern. Native fish impacts, that's a biggie too. If you look at the middle fork of the Flathead and the north fork of the Flathead and the Flathead forks in general, we still have large, robust, viable populations of native cutthroat trout and bull trout. And in particular, cutthroat trout, our fisheries biologist actually made a move because of increased use to single point only a year ago. And that was in part due to hooking scars on a lot of these trout that get caught over and over again. And they're very vulnerable to being caught. And it's a lot of fun. Who's not going to want to float the middle fork in those tourmaline pools and catch a cutthroat trout on their trip out here? But some of these fish can be caught over and over again. So we moved away from 3 points like a treble hook to a single point. Ungulates. So another concern with displaced visitors, particularly in the shoulder seasons, and we hear a lot about marketing the peak seasons. for fish, from a fish and wildlife perspective, the shoulder seasons in winter are sensitive. The shoulder seasons are when they get a break. And for most ungulates, the mating occurs in the fall, that shoulder season. And in winter is not an easy time for fish or wildlife. Most of the species, they need to make it through with the reserves they've accumulated during the summer and fall, spring, summer, and fall. And then spring is the very critical end of winter vulnerable period, and often, calving and fawning starts. And so visitation in those going up in the shoulder seasons in the front country where there are wintering ungulates is going to affect calving, elk. In fact, it's very difficult to quantify those impacts, but in Colorado, they're starting to do just that. And they're looking at what point do elk calves die because of recreation displacement. And they're looking at about, I think it was about 30% of them died when the cows were disturbed 7 or more times, 10 or more times, they all died. And you can just Google recreation and elk in Colorado and see some of that work. But it's very difficult to quantify. There's a lot of opinions and a lot of, barbershop opinions going on the impacts of recreation, but we need more data, bottom line. So I think the combination of displaced glacier visitors and all of the other new arrivals that showed up in the last 2 years. The county told me 35,000 new vehicles, and that doesn't equate to new families. It'd be a smaller number because of multiple vehicles per family. We have a big job in front of us to teach people how to recreate responsibly with wildlife, with bears, even native fish conservation. So the challenge is in front of us to get ahead of that curve, because that's a lot of new visitors, and a lot of these visitors get inspired and buy homes here. And that leads me to my last impact is they want to, new people, folks want to buy something. They want to buy a home. They want to buy land. And that's an incredible economic incentive to subdivide your land, which clearly has impacts to fish and wildlife resources as well as agriculture. So, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has been fortunate to work with a lot of our corporate timberland owners as Plum Creek changed to Weyerhaeuser, and Weyerhaeuser sold to Southern Pines. And then obviously it's broken into smaller units. Virtually every one of these new corporate timberland owners and the traditional owners have been very good to work with on access for all of us, whether it's summer access or hunting and angling, and in many cases conservation easements where that access and the subdivision issue is addressed permanently in perpetuity. So we're very fortunate there. There's a lot of factors, a lot of variables, and I'll leave it at that with wildlife and move on to parks. And of course, I'd be happy to answer any questions when we're done. Next slide. So I'm going to be Dave now. I'm going to put on my Dave Landstrom hat with that big ram. That is the largest ram ever measured from Wild Horse Island, 216, just a bruiser. And next slide, please. Even our state parks, FWP does not own a lot of land, even if you combine our acres under fee title and conservation easement. We're not like the Forest Service or DNRC or BLM. However, the recreation sites we do own in fee title are extremely popular. And those of you that are familiar with Montana state parks, or wildlife management areas or wildlife habitat protection areas, we do have key select targeted pieces of ownership. And this graphic here just shows statewide the increase in 3 years. And just like everyone else has experienced, we cannot meet the demand for outdoor recreation, particularly on water-based parks in summer anymore. And this happened prior to the implementation of the ticketed entry in Glacier. So going into ticketed entry, we were pretty nervous. We knew we were full. And, talking with Jeff Mao, all the agency leaders are great. We have a lot of communication. We're like, how are we going to spread these around? Hungry Horse perhaps, or west of town, because many of our parks were full already going into ticketed entry. And indeed, they showed up at our front desk. They called on the phone. We can't get into Glacier Park. Where can I go in Whitefish Lake? Where can I go on Flathead Lake? Where can I go? And those calls were pretty much nonstop. And here we are in October, and it's finally starting to slow down. And that particularly was exacerbated in the western and central parts of Montana, more so than the east or southeast. Although I'd project that folks are going to make it there as well. Next slide. So locally here, this just shows, it's kind of fascinating actually, the difference between 2 years, because we had, and all of this on top of a pandemic. It was very difficult for our fishing access site staff. They have the smaller pieces along the rivers and lakes, and our park staff, to, go in and keep the toilets clean and keep the parks safe for visitors with COVID protocols and sterilization. You can imagine the challenge and the fear. We worked through it. They did a great job. And I think overall, most of the visitors throughout the pandemic, that was a place of psychological relief to go outside when they're looking at the news and seeing, trucks, morgue trucks in big cities. They're out here, taking a break. And I think they provided a real value here in Montana, our state parks, during the pandemic, because we never closed them. Governors did not want them closed. They wanted them open. They wanted them staffed. And it was a place where people could go and get some relief outside, and a lot of it was on water at a lake or a river. And that's a fishing access site or a state park or a DNRC site or a Forest Service site, particularly when Glacier was closed. So here locally, Flathead Lake, far and above, just got slammed. At Wayfarers, which is in Big Fork, we were at many times, just like West Glacier, one in, one out. It got that busy. And we don't have a large staff in our parks and outdoor rec division to begin with. So we had to be creative with volunteers and partners. It was crazy busy, but Whitefish Lake off the charts. Les Mason on Whitefish Lake State Park. And, a lot of the displaced visitors landed in Whitefish. In July and August, I live in Whitefish. It's like living in an amusement park. There's so many people now, but that's why we live there. There's a lot going on, a lot of fun to be had, but it is busy. But this visitation did trickle over into Thompson Chain of Lakes between here and Libby and down to Thompson Falls to a lesser degree. But overall, it was kind of neat. The positive is to hear the value that our parks and our fishing access sites, cultural parks, water-based parks, you name it, the value that Montana residents and visitors, place on those parks. So that was kind of inspiring. But I guess I'll leave it with that because I know we're catching up time-wise, and I'll hold off for questions.
All right. Finally, our last speaker is Diane Medler. She's the director of Discover Kalispell, which is the Convention and Visitors Bureau for Kalispell. And after hearing everybody else, I'd like to think that her job has gotten remarkably easier due to the popularity of the Valley, but I suspect it's far more complicated than that. So she's going to give us an idea of the impact that the ticketed entry system had on local communities and businesses.
All right. Yes. Thanks for having me. And yes, you're right. It has just made it much more complicated because we are a partner with all of these folks that came before me and a lot of other tourism groups, and make sure that we have a balance and help to educate our visitors. So next slide. 2021 was a tough summer. Ticketed entry was just one component that forced adjustments for both visitors and residents, but it was just one of several logistics that we all had to deal with. And we did a lot of different things to educate visitors, both when they're planning their trip and when they were here in market, as well as supporting our other tourism partners. One of the main things we did is we had a bi-weekly call. We call it our tourism communication group. The Flathead National Forest, FWP, Glacier Park, Explore Whitefish, Discover Kalispell, Glacier Country Regional Tourism, Whitefish Mountain Resort, all of and to help each other with the messaging. What was the important messaging that we needed to get out? Talk regularly with Montana Department of Transportation and all those other entities. Our visitor center was very busy. We had website chat, calls. We use our social media, blogs, and dedicated web pages to get out information. We provided printed materials for our hotels and rental car partners to distribute to each of their guests. And all of this information helped to educate the visitors on ticketed entry, but all the other items listed on the slide there, the rental car shortages and road construction, and a lot about how to recreate responsibly. Next slide. So on the ticketed entry specifically, there were a lot of positive things. The coordinated messaging, as I said, we talk regularly. I think the visitor information center that the park put up in Hungry Horse was a good added benefit. A lot of visitors were able to stop there and get information before they got to the park. The entrance traffic filtering system worked well. We heard a lot of good positive feedback about that. And, you know, there's pros and cons to encouraging visits to other areas and amenities in the valley. And the previous speakers spoke of some, you know, complications with pushing people out of the park, but some other benefits. And what we really highlighted for people were, you know, the other types of amenities and activities, such as, you know, guided kayaking trips on Flathead Lake, guided trail rides, such as like Artemis Acres here in Kalispell. So there's other activities outside of the public lands. Some of the main confusion points with ticketed entry and in the visitor lens was the late release of the notice. And the park knows that it was released late, and they're working on that. It was very impactful for visitors. Visitors that come to Glacier Park for a summer trip, they plan up to a year in advance, at least 6 months in advance. So many people already had their plane tickets and their hotel reservations and their rental car, if they were lucky. And then they got word that they had to buy a ticket. And in some cases, they couldn't get a ticket for the time that they were here. So they had to cancel their entire trip. So that needs to be addressed. Then the uncertainty of the rules between the areas of the park were very confusing for visitors. They didn't understand that if they had a lodging reservation at Many Glacier, that they still couldn't get in the Going to Sun Road. Confusion with the shuttle ticket, buying a shuttle ticket that is not an entry ticket, and also camping. And then the issues with recreation.gov, which Mary spoke about. And then the 7-day ticket was confusing. Do we need a ticket for everyone in the vehicle? Do we need a ticket for every day? Although the information is clearly stated in a lot of different sources, it created a lot of confusion. So we'll continue to talk with the park. You know, we support the park's effort to manage traffic volume. And I think that those who've got tickets, it really made for a much better experience for them. So the sooner the better to make a decision for next summer. And because of rental car shortages this year, we are already seeing reservations for next summer, as are the rental car agencies. Next slide. So here's just a snapshot of summer 2021. It was very busy. There was strong demand and the rates reflected that. Lodging capacity in the valley continues to increase, and that's mostly due to the increase in short-term rentals. So short-term rentals such as Airbnb and VRBO in Flathead County add an additional 6,000 rooms to the overall lodging inventory. So each rental unit averages 2.2 rooms. So that doubles the inventory of our traditional lodging, which is about 3,200 guest rooms. Occupancy for both short-term rentals and traditional lodging was in right around 90% plus, give or take. The other impact for the strong demand this summer is the airport. They had 3 new carriers and introduced 6 new destinations, and all of those flights were summer only. The increases over 2019, June was up 29% for in-plane passengers. July was up 17%. August was up 16%. July saw over 70,000 enplanements in 1 month on a one-time record. So just so you know, Glacier Aero is a nonprofit organization consisting of both business and tourism industry reps. And we work to secure increased air service for winter and more year-round service. We are not out there attracting more summer service. The airport is over capacity until they finish their terminal expansion. And we have enough flights in the summer. We want flights that provide us more year-round service and more access for winter guests, both for visitors and for our business community. One of the positives of this summer, though, is ground transportation options increased. So because of the rental car issues, the airport secured an agreement with Turo. Turo is a kind of a car sharing app for those who aren't familiar. They allow Turo to operate at GPIA. It also increased the number of Uber and Lyft drivers and taxi services. So that was a positive. We've been needing some increased options for ground transportation. The rental car shortages was a big issue, and that was a nationwide issue, but certainly impacted our area. The crisis did minimize by the end of July. They were able to get more fleet into the market, and they are preparing for next summer, not selling off as much fleet, excuse me, as they normally would. But as I said, they are already getting reservations for next summer. The staffing challenges were real, delays and closures, limited menus. Hotels had to put a certain number of their rooms out of inventory because they didn't have the staff to clean them. And visitor response was certainly mixed, even though a lot of the issues that we experienced this summer were national issues, such as the rental cars and workforce shortages. The higher rates and the shortages of availability of things still caught many visitors unaware. Next slide. So Discover Kalispell plays many roles, and one is destination stewardship. We really take a community first approach. A tourism destination like ours is a really complex system. It requires partnerships and sensitivity to local, regional, and national issues. Areas such as ours that are experiencing increased tourism and overcrowding, we have a heightened sensitivity and frustration, giving conversations around sustainable tourism a new urgency. And visitors are experiencing this inconvenience of overcrowding and are witnessing effects of climate change on many of their favorite vacation spots, not just here. So the shift is starting to happen in their mindset as well. So I think there's room for more awareness of being respectful for where they visit, and recreating responsibly and all that's included in that. And there's a growing importance to be strategic for us and our other tourism promotion partners to be mindful on our partnerships with our local public land agencies, recreate responsibly campaigns that complement other local, state, and national messaging, minimizing summer for visitations, which we have always done. We've never directed paid media towards summer. July and August are going to be busy no matter what. First time visitors especially come here for Glacier National Park, and they come here to drive the full length of the Going to Sun Road. So Glacier Park is the draw in the summer, and that will never change. What we spend our efforts on in summer is visitor management, educating the visitors before they arrive, while they're planning their trip, and when they're in the ground. And also, we continue to intentionally feature less popular areas and seasons and activities. And also our partnerships with the chamber and the city, for example, enable us to be involved in conversations around smart growth, addressing the pain points and the needs of businesses. And we work with businesses and such as group event planners that we work with to bring meetings and conventions here, and really encourage sustainable practices. Example, encourage them not to offer individual water bottles, to donate unused food, no disposable tableware. So, and also we have a strong effort to be mindful of inclusivity and diversity. We are increasing our information, available information and assets on outdoor accessibility for all, and working with other groups in that regard. Next slide, please. So our main role as a Convention and Visitors Bureau is destination marketing. And so that is our main role, but the shift continues to grow on the destination stewardship side, management, stewardship, and development. We're fully aware there needs to be a balance. There is a need for robust year-round tourism economy to help support our local businesses, but we need to proactively address the capacity issues. We use our paid, earned, and owned media to direct it towards leisure travel outside of summer, but as well as meetings and conventions and other group travel, which are a good fit for the shoulder seasons. And we'll continue to honor our local culture by highlighting local stories, such as our Kalispell Discovery Guides. So thank you. I know that we're a little short on time, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap up here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. And I think it would be helpful, since there are so many of us on the call, to maybe summarize questions or groups of questions. And Mary, I know you answered some questions in the chat, but maybe having a discussion about them will trigger other questions and other thoughts. So I'll have Sarah do that. In the meantime, we mark your calendars. The next note in December, and we've got to set the dates, but we are going to do a deep dive on the latest funding sources, existing, new, prospective initiatives at the federal and state level for outdoor recreation, conservation and recreation, with a focus on outdoor recreation and a focus on front country recreation, particularly those funding sources that can be maybe accessed by rural communities. There's never been a time where there's been more available resources in terms of funding, but it's also extremely challenging for communities to access those resources because of the way that they interact with each other, the difference between federal and state, the fact that they're new and maybe don't have the rules. So that's what we're going to be looking at in December. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Sarah, to guide us through the question and answer.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks to all of our speakers. Super fascinating information. I have my own list of questions, so if other people don't ask them, I will just appease myself. But I do want to start off with one, because I think this is an interesting question for Jim that was put in the question and answer box, that you noted you haven't seen an increase in injuries and deaths for humans related to the growing number of people in bear habitat, but what about bears?
Who asked that? It's a good question. Just right now, as we're having this webinar, my crews are processing 2 500-pound-ish grizzly bears that from Columbia Falls that came into town as a result of human attractants. So, at Whitefish, Big Fork, Ferndale, Columbia Falls, even Kalispell, human bear attractants are an issue, have been an issue, will be an issue. My statement that we haven't had the human injuries, was relatively one-sided. The flip side is, as bears are handled, and for instance, these 2 bears, if they're new, they become a management bear, and we track them, and they get a few strikes in some cases before we put them down, or send them to a zoo, which is tougher and tougher to do, and almost impossible for a larger adult bear. So we do put them down. And even though our agency ultimately kills that bear or family of bears, as happened in Polbridge earlier this summer. It's a result of them being fed by, either community members or visitors or businesses or restaurants. It's all about sanitation. It's all about bear proofing, your waste, grease pits in the case of a restaurant. It's not easy to do. We're sure there to lend a helping hand, but human attractants do kill bears. And I guess to answer that question, I'd have to get the numbers, but the most high profile one that I received calls and complaints and people were pretty upset about was when we made the decision, along with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they're the lead for any endangered species, to put that family down out of Polbridge this summer. But those bears died because they became too habituated to human attractants, and then they become a threat to human safety. So we don't take a chance, we put them down. The good news is, from a population perspective, there's a certain amount of discretionary mortality that any population can incur. The last I checked, we were still within that allowable limit, but on any given year, we push that. And I'd have to look at the data. I don't have it in front of me right now, but that's a good question. Good point. Yeah, bears do die.
Thanks, Jim. Diane, a question for you around the idea. I mean, I guess we've all heard this before, that people think that Glacier is closed in the wintertime because you can't access the Sun Road, and that the park doesn't open until the Sun Road opens. And we're hearing from you saying that people canceled their trips because they couldn't get a ticket to the Sun Road. And while that is definitely a signature experience within the park, like, how do we change the perception that Glacier is closed or that you can't access the park if you can't drive on the Sun Road?
Exactly. That is an ongoing effort, and I think it's definitely a team effort. So there are a lot of amenities that do close in the park, like particularly after Labor Day. But I think we can be mindful of how we message the park and not make it sound like so many things are closing that maybe the park is not as good of an experience. If there's ways to increase some amenities or available activities for people, let's say in winter, the ranger-led snowshoe hikes, they are a really popular activity. And if we can find a way to provide that kind of amenity for visitors, that makes them feel more comfortable in the park. So a lot of visitors feel more comfortable in the summer because they can, be in their car, they're driving on the road, and there's lots of rangers around, there's lots of people around, and they have a more sense of a comfort. Whereas in the winter, it all feels very primitive, right? So there's no restaurants or a lot of other amenities available. So we need to find ways to help them feel more comfortable in the park off of the peak summer season. But a lot of it is messaging, and we continue to work together with the park and our other partners and try and turn that around.
If I can pop in here really quickly. Mary referenced she was seeking input on the ticketed entry system. And there was a slide in there that talked about the types of questions that they want feedback on. It's in the chat, but I just want to say it, Mary_Riddle@nps.gov. If you want to provide feedback or continue the dialogue about the ticketed entry system.
Another question, I think probably for both Chris and Mary and potentially Jim, and actually ties into a question that I wanted to ask as well. Diane mentioned that Discover Kalispell is encouraging visitors to go to less busy areas. And the question is, what are the consequences of that for wildlife and locals and others seeking more solitude? And it tees off of my question, which is, how do we protect a variety of experiences, including that backcountry solitude, to as we move forward with ever increasing visitation? So maybe this is just you just jump right in there and answer to anybody kind of thing.
Sarah, I'll go first. As I said, that was one of the aspects that we were not able to collect a lot of data on this summer about impacts on wildlife, but certainly protecting resources and the visitor experience is something that was a big topic in the Going to the Sun Road Corridor Management Plan that we completed. That was not obviously a park-wide plan, but it includes a lot of tools to be able to maintain that diversity of experiences and provide opportunities for solitude in different areas of the park. So certainly within the corridor, and that's something that I think there will be more future work on.
Mr. Jim, thoughts?
Yeah, I just, in terms of shoulder seasons again, one issue that's arose on social media recently is in Wyoming where, recreators that bumped up with hunters and had some conflict. And I think, the shoulder seasons traditionally, from a fish and wildlife perspective, are, they get a break in the valley. There are traditional uses like hunting seasons and fishing seasons. However, as outdoor recreation becomes more and more popular and this growth that we've experienced, one thing that we'll all have to wrestle with too is, the front country recreation, to manage potential conflicts with traditional, types of consumptive recreation like hunting and angling. So it's just, I'll throw that out there. We're looking at it, no answers. It's an issue. The more people you pile in the woods and on the mountain, the more that are doing different things with different values, the more conflicts you can have. But that clearly, potentially, maybe an issue here. It was in Wyoming recently, and it's on our radar. So.
Yeah, Sarah, I don't really have the perfect answer to your question. I mean, obviously on the forest, we provide a lot of different diversity of recreation experiences, and we do want to protect those areas that, folks can go find solitude. My best response is we need to just continue to work together on educating new visitors when they come here, what it means to be, what your recreation experiences is like and your expectations on the forest versus the park, or in the wilderness versus the front country. I think we have a lot of work to do around that, but I think there's a lot of good things we can do to try to get that message out so folks know what to expect and why they're having that primitive experience. Dispersed camping is not developed campground camping, and what you should expect and what you should be prepared for. But yeah, no hard answer on that one.
Anybody else, any thoughts? Otherwise, Diane, do we have room for one more question? Mike?
We are at 12:28, so we have room for a question, and folks can hang around with us if you want. Map team, can you please put the question about that Mary had in her slide up on the screen?
The stakeholder feedback.
Yeah.
Last question in the chat box was the involvement of Flathead County in terms of cross-agency discussions and whether the Flathead County Park System is an alternative for outdoor recreation seekers. And I have no idea who might be able to answer that question. Anybody that was been in those conversations, is the county there at all?
I'll speak for our conversations. The county has not been involved. The county parks has not been involved. That's perhaps something we should look at.
Okay, well, we're up against the time, and I mean, it is amazing how fast 90 minutes can go with such fascinating topics. Hey, thanks to all of you. I'm going to let Sarah wrap it up here, but I just want to personally thank you, each of you, for bringing your perspectives. I think it's hard to have these cross-silo discussions about tourism talks to tourism, and parks talks to parks, and recreation managers talk to recreation managers. So I really want to thank each one of you for taking the time to share your insights with.
Thank you for the
Yeah, I
opportunity.
think this has been a fantastic discussion, and hopefully it's just the beginning of future discussions around the idea that, you know, we all need to be working together and talking together, and maybe thinking about what recreation infrastructure we have and what we need, and how we protect that full suite of experiences for people that are coming, but also for our local residents, and how we do all of these things together, and talk about the cumulative impact of decisions that we make and how it plays out across the landscape and affects wildlife. These are big topics, but I think they're big topics of the future that we need to start tearing down those silos and working and talking together. So I'm really excited to see these conversations come together. And so thank you, Diane and Rachel and the MAP team, for all you guys do and for inviting us to co-sponsor this.
Super. Well, with that, we will sign off. The webinars are, archived webinars are available. It usually takes a couple of days for us to get the video on. The slide decks will be available. The video will be available as an archive, and feel free to get in touch with us if you think of other topics or want to hear about other topics or want to continue the discussion. So thank you. Thanks to everyone. Bye-bye.